Good evening. Now, before we get started, I'm going to pull the professor, and I would like to ask some of you who are in the back to come a little closer if you could. You don't have to get too packed because, of course, we need to have some distance. But keep in mind, the goal today is in some sense to have a discussion. We're going to discuss what happened almost 20 years ago in 9/11 and its consequences. And I think although this room is very big, it would be very helpful if, just in terms of, I think, just setting, if you'd come a bit closer. Well, I'm happy to be here and to kick off our alumni weekend and to do so in person. You may know last year we had to do things online, and I saw some of you online, though of course without masks, a year ago. I'm delighted to see you here tonight. I should say that like last year, though, we have many alumni who are joining us virtually, and so thank you for coming as well, and we look forward to your participation. This is the first time that we're doing an alumni weekend that is hybrid, so it's an opportunity for those of you who couldn't make it to Berlin still to participate in our activities. And indeed, we have over 150 alumni who are registered for this weekend. And I want to make one announcement, and then we'll jump into the panel. In terms of the announcement, just a reminder that tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at the Henriette Hertz Park, not Platz, but Park, near Potsdamer Platz, we will just have a brief remembrance of President Henrik Enderlein. So if you can join us, we do this intentionally with the alumni because, of course, Henrik had the most students, I think, of any professor at the Hertie School. He had almost all of you at some stage in Economics 1, and many of you know him and knew him. So please, if you get the opportunity, please come tomorrow morning. If it's like this, we're okay. It's just a little cloudy. If there's a little rain, just bring an umbrella. I mean, I think we can survive even the weather if it's a little gray and rainy. Well, the next thing to talk about, of course, is our panel marking 20 years of 9/11. I can tell you, I remember where I was 20 years ago. I was at the University of Pittsburgh. I was an assistant professor. At the University of Pittsburgh, if you know anything about United Flight 93, there was one of the 4 planes that actually, on its way back, went over Pittsburgh. We didn't know what was happening at the time. We heard fire alarms. It turned out the tallest building in Pittsburgh was on campus, and they did a mass quick evacuation as fast as they could. Now that plane, if you don't know that history, landed in Somerset County, a county away from Pittsburgh. It did not hit anything in Pittsburgh itself, but as you may know, it was the one plane where the people got an idea what was happening, and of course forced the plane down before it could go to Washington. I should say as well, in terms of memories, my wife was in a plane at that time, but thankfully she was over Africa. She was nowhere in North America on her way to her first conference ever in South America, but it took some weeks for her to come back. That, I should add, is an inconvenience. That's all that was, compared to many other lives that were lost that day and to what this has indeed meant over these past 20 years. So we're here today to talk about the legacy of 9/11, to think a bit about things that have happened quite recently in Afghanistan. And I'm delighted to have our panel, but I'm not the one to introduce it. I'd like to first introduce Axel Beisch, our managing director, to come up. He's been very involved, of course, with our Hertie Alumni Network, and I'm delighted to have you. So come on up, Axel.
Thank you, Mark. Well, dear colleagues, dear alumni, I actually would like to address now many alumni. I know they're on their way. They're still somewhere down there in the cafeteria, getting to know each other again, meeting each other again in person. And I know we have more than 120 registrations for this evening alone. So I hope they'll be coming in June while we talk. But all of you out there, be most welcome for this reunion. We're really very happy to meet again in person. And to keep it rather short, just a big thank you to Communications Alumni Affairs. Giovanna is somewhere around here, but she doesn't need to stand up right now because everybody knows you, Giovanna. And Jen, thanks a lot for organizing, making this happen. And we're really looking forward to this exciting weekend, ending then only on Sunday noon, where we're going to have the last session. Register already 60 persons. I wonder how the attendance will be on Sunday noon, if I see the attendance right now, but we manage. And great pleasure now to introduce the panel today. I would ask you to come up. Andreas first, please. Dear friend and sailor, Andreas von Brandt, EU Ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, just talked to us. Good personal friend, very happy to see you healthy and with us here today. Then Marina Henke, Professor of International Relations at the Hertie School and Director of the Center for International Security, as a very active and, of course, expert very much in this field. Then we have Bajir Feda. Here you go, Bajir. Alumnus of MPP 2014, be most welcome, head of the unit Afghanistan and Central South Asia at the Berker Foundation here, situated in Berlin, working closely together with the German Foreign Office. And of course, Andreas and Bajir know each other, being somehow in the same field, talking a lot about Doha and Qatar, etc., then later. And then, of course, last but not least at all, Harmke. Be most welcome here, Harmke Kruthoff, MPP 2014, so same class as Bajir. Policy officer at the UE delegation to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and they're also a colleague of Andreas von Brandt, and she will now take over and moderate the discussion. Thanks a lot, all of you, for being here, and Harmke, I leave it to you. Thanks.
All right, so just checking if this works well. I think so. I think you can all hear me. Great. All right, well, let's get started. Maybe just to set the scene a little bit. I mean, Mark already shared some of his sort of personal experiences on the day, and I think I remember being very on that day as well, sort of remembering exactly coming home from school and this kind of, you know, different generation, but also remembering clearly sort of what happened that day, and I don't think many of us will forget. So as you mentioned, we're on the eve, let's say, of 20 years since 9/11, the terror attacks and the advent of the war on terror. Just in August, as the withdrawal of the US military was coming to a close, President Biden declared the end to an era in which the US uses military to remake other countries. Promises made by the Taliban in Doha on the role of women, of minorities, seem to have been abandoned. Chaotic scenes at the airport and border crossings of Afghans fleeing uncertainty of what was to come next, I think have all been on our news feeds. I even saw that the BBC is still running its live blog, which I think is one of the longest live blogs I've seen. Sort of the past month, they've been updating that every 10 minutes. So today we want to take a sort of bird's eye view on key sort of Hertie topics, such as governance in Afghanistan, the economic situation, the situation on human rights and diplomatic relations. We have an incredibly experienced panel. After the last weeks, they're probably also incredibly sleep deprived, but I'm still very excited that they're here. And I would say let's jump right in. My first question is for Andreas. On Tuesday, the Taliban announced its interim government, and the chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, who I'm sure you know very well, Shahrazad Akbar, said that it's hard to see how this interim government fits any criteria of engagement with the world, but then the world always surprised in how low it held the bar. Yesterday, the EU expressed its concern about this new interim government, and I was wondering if you could perhaps expand on that concern, what that means, and how you assess this interim government. I think it's already on.
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me here. I would say the new government is, in a way, a slap in the face of the international community and all the assurances. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing that it's also very bad for Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is is a multi-ethnic, is a very divided, fractured country. And any government can only succeed if it has inclusivity and a certain buy-in of the major parties. And that's not happening. I mean, the Taliban might claim, actually they do claim, that it's inclusive with regard to the internal Taliban rifts that there are. And that is probably also something. Quite frankly, from their perspective, it is quite something, because they are equally divided. And if the first enthusiasm is over, then they may discover the fault lines and the problems that they face. So, I mean, from a naive point of view, you could say it's an inclusive Taliban government, but it's definitely not an inclusive Afghan government. And on the other hand, you know, quite frankly, and I mean, I already admitted an hour ago that we are a bit puzzled and perplexed ourselves at the moment, and we need some time to reflect. But I would say, had they nominated, and forgive me that word, a token woman or one single representative technocrat, would that have really changed our, you know, our analysis? I mean, our final word on the government. So it's very tricky. Of course, we would have liked to see a government that was truly inclusive, you know, with many women, with many representatives from all several disciplines and several political groupings, ethnic. There is, for example, no Hazara represented. So where does it lead? It's very hard to tell. The High Representative Borrell has made very clear that it's not only what we would have expected, but not what was promised to us by the Taliban. And we're all looking for a very bumpy ride in Afghanistan.
That's for sure, I think. Marina, I just wanted to ask you, do you think, some have said also that the composition of the government is somehow a provocation to the international community, considering that 20 of the 31 members of this interim government are on the UN sanctions list? So I wanted to see if you see that as well in that way.
Let me first say that I'm delighted to be here, and we have our EU representative and I would say somebody who's working for a German foundation. So I would like to take on a kind of an American perspective. I have lived in the United States for a very long time, and I've basically kind of seen the Afghanistan operation from a largely American perspective. And the truth is that for a lot of folks right now in the Pentagon, and particularly in the Biden White House, who is in charge in Afghanistan doesn't matter. It's you know, as simple as that. So you know, you mentioned whether there's a token woman or a token Hazara. For Biden, the priority was to get out. This is a war that he already perceived lost, you know, years ago. He was against the surge. This was very controversial back when he was the vice president in the Obama administration. And this is basically, a waste of American resources, a waste of American time, and the strategic objectives and focus of the United States going forward is somewhere else, right? This is the Pacific, this is China, and everything that happens in Afghanistan is basically just a drag. So in the big picture of things, of course, you know, one could be very upset, and one probably should be upset of what happened and, you know, composition of the government and all these kind of things. But I think the one actor who could maybe put pressure on the government and make the changes has zero interest, and that's probably, you know, like, we just have to take it as a given and deal with it.
Okay, thanks for that. And definitely making some points that I would like to come back to later. But maybe just to complete our round, Basir, do you kind of agree with the sentiments shared so far on would it have made a difference, one token woman, or does it matter actually who's now in charge if the US has moved its focus elsewhere?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, it's great to be here after quite a lot of time and countless nights that we've spent in these halls. I don't think that it would have probably made any significant change if there was any token woman or a token Hazara, to be honest. But I look at this from a rather different perspective. We have worked very closely, Andreas knows this, with the Taliban. We have very closely accompanied the negotiations process that was happening in Doha, that of course also had to come to an abrupt end. I think what is more important is, and coming from the field that me and my colleagues come from, it's important to understand also the problems that the Taliban themselves face. It's only putting yourself in their shoes that you can actually understand what interests there are that they are trying to protect. And the internal cohesion of the movement is one very big element that factors into their decision-making processes. There are also some other elements of maybe emotions coming into it. For 20 years, you know, we were bombed. Nobody was talking about that, but everybody is talking about, you know, whatever we did. And there is also an element of truth to that. In the last 20 years, a lot has transpired in this country. If you would talk to elites in Kabul, they would always tell you, oh, but, you know, of course, put it always on Pakistan, on this country, on that country. The reality is that this insurgency did not come out of the blue. There were drivers of conflict, and that's why we are where we are today. I think what is more important is to focus on the way forward, and that is for, you know, the EU and the West and other countries to think about, okay, what now? Engagement or no engagement because the government is not inclusive? Because both of those would have, you would have different outcomes and different consequences for making those kind of decisions, right? And to me, I do what I do because I'm, you know, there's still a sense of optimism that I have, otherwise you wouldn't be doing what I do. And I think that this is not the end of Afghanistan. I think that there is always a room for improvement. It hasn't happened today. But also think about the 20 years ago. Somebody tweeted the other day, when the first ever cabinet was announced, 18 members were from one province. Is that, you know, we have been, Afghanistan has been on this juncture many times over in the last 700 years. This is not to say, okay, now it's all over. It's not. There's nothing ideal about any of this. The speed with which the government fell was shocking to literally everyone, the Taliban included. I think we have to give ourselves a little bit of time. We have to think about also the ways in which the international community can engage with the Taliban on the basis of mutual interest, but also try to understand what interests they are following. This is the reality, whether you like it or not. So the question is, do you want to do something about it to make it better? And even if there is a low probability that that will happen, whether that is a more preferred option to complete isolation and turning Afghanistan into another North Korea, where, by the way, it's not just the Taliban, but another 35 million people are living, and where you're looking at a human catastrophe already in the making.
Definitely. I mean, I think that's actually leads quite nicely into the next topic I wanted to talk about, which is indeed a bit the topic of one thing is government, the other thing is governance, right? And there's we can see there is change also in attitude sort of in different provinces from different governors. So I wanted to, Andreas, move back to you and kind of ask, do you think that the EU sort of as an actor would be capable or looking at also maybe engaging in certain provinces where there are governors that are more open for EU principles than others? Sort of is the institution able to kind of make that difference sort of on its implementation and operational engagement, as they've recently called it, so not recognition, but operational engagement? How would that look like?
I mean, we have for the moment the informal foreign ministers, the Gimnich meeting last week, and we will have soon council conclusions. So I cannot kind of preclude those, but. What I would say is traditionally development assistance is done with the government of a country, and anything else may be creative and probably non-conventional or anything. And I agree with you, there might be ideas to that effect, but I don't think that it is it's practically possible. We will most likely request from the de facto interim government of Afghanistan to abide by certain criteria that we have made very clear throughout these years. And if they don't abide by them, then it's the end of development assistance. It's quite as simple as that. Whether I believe academically whether there is a possibility to attract certain moderates or to attract certain provinces, again, that's a more academic debate, but I would think it is possible. Again, Afghanistan is a very diverse country, if not, as I said, a fractured country, and the Taliban movement itself is very diverse and complex. It's probably maybe overlooked at the moment in this enthusiasm or this success from their perspective to having overrun basically the entire territory. But once they govern and try to govern, they will see these problems. But if I may, just to come back on Basir's point, and he knows, and you know that I've always been one of the actually proponents of dialogue with the Taliban and taking a realistic approach. But I must also say, just take, and all comparison is always a bit difficult and tricky, but let's say you have a right-wing government in Europe or somewhere, an extremist government. What did we do? And you can argue whether this was good, whether it was successful and led to the results we wanted, but we somehow sidelined or cordoned or boycotted that government, you know, and that is, in principle, what could happen also to the Taliban. So it's. You know, I know the Berkov mantra and the Berkov philosophy that you have to put yourself in the look at things from the perspective of the other. Of course, that's nice and that's fine to all mediation and conflict resolution. But on the other hand, the conflict is somewhat over, and the Taliban has won this war. And now I think it's also our right to establish certain criteria. You know, we cannot forever put ourselves in the shoes of the Taliban.
I can see Marina would like to come in. Did you want to respond to the conflict being over, or was there another point you wanted to pick up on?
No, I just want to make it crystal clear that, you know, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the European Union, and I'm a huge fan of diplomacy and development aid and all these beautiful initiatives. But I think we have to see crystal clear, without a military protection in Afghanistan that was, for the largest part, provided by the United States, it's very hard for any kind of actors to operate on the ground. And I think this is very often the denial, right? The denial of a lot of European actors, and even here in the German media, you know, very often we should have stayed longer. There should have been a European force. If the Americans go, we should have stayed. We could have kept 500 troops. Realistically, and you know, I'm sure you're familiar with these data, 500 troops cannot protect Kabul. 500 troops can't do anything. And if I just look at the German government, all they tried for the last 10 years in Afghanistan was basically to prevent any casualties from occurring. There was no military strategy. And of course, we can discuss whether this was, you know, the right way to deal with Afghanistan in the first place. But once it was a war zone, once there was violence on a daily basis, you had to use the military to protect all the development workers. And once the Americans were gone, the EU, and I'm, you know, generalizing, but picking on the Germans, do not have the capabilities and did not provide that security. So now to say the EU should do X, Y, Z without the military protection is, you know, it's not really realistic. And I think that's super important to point out.
Thanks for that point, because it actually connects nicely to a quote I read in Politico, and that I wanted to suggest to Andreas, where the journalist wrote that despite all the talk of European autonomy, strategic autonomy, Washington is still setting the agenda. If you look at it from a military perspective. So I wanted to see if you agree with that statement, if you think there's sort of more complexity to the argument of sort of you need military presence of the US, for example, in Afghanistan to be able to deliver humanitarian or development assistance, or do you think that the EU can manage this on its own?
Well, first of all, I forgot to mention that we are not. I mean, I was. Let's say, theoretically talking about boycott and all of that, but the current policy of the European Union is endorsed by all foreign ministers, is that there are 5 criteria. Basically, the Taliban, 5 criteria for interaction, for engagement with the Taliban. Not to facilitate terror anymore, respect human rights, particularly women's rights, allow for the further evacuation of Afghans at risk, allow for humanitarian assistance to come in, and what was the 5th criteria?
Inclusive government.
Yeah, sure. The inclusive government, where you can now debate whether this has already failed or not, but the Taliban call it an interim or a caretaker government, so there is a bit the hope. It's probably also a bit of an ambitious hope, but there is hope that this interim nature may lead to something else. So what I mean is we may have engagement with the Taliban to avoid the worst, as I said in my introduction, because the humanitarian situation is very dire, and we have a moral obligation, but also we have we want to avoid massive migration to Europe. So that is important, I think, to point out. And sorry, repeat your question. I'm a bit lost.
Sort of the strategic autonomy of the EU.
Oh, yeah, sure. The strategic autonomy. I think our High Representative has made that very clear. We would have needed a better, improved, robust capability, for example, to secure the airport. There are the European battle groups actually in existence, and member states could have called them and could have used them. So there is an instrumentarium at place. We could have used them, and very specifically in our case, the EU delegations have been secured by contracted, basically commercial security, because we don't have police forces or military. So even there, at this level, you can see how much this is needed, and especially for crisis management. So on the question whether the US run the show, it's not for me to comment on. What I can say is that most of our EU member states are also NATO allies, and as NATO allies, they have consented, or at least not objected, all the decisions at NATO when it came to the US-Taliban deal, or when it came to the withdrawal. So I would say it's not only a US decision, and then even if you take that decision, I think there would have been ample space to still push both sides more forcefully into a peace deal. It would not have been a perfect deal, and that is a bit my personal preliminary lesson learned, because we funded 90% of the security sector, not we, but the international community, and 75% of all public expenditure. But we did not really dare to push the government of Afghanistan to making a deal. And that deal wouldn't have been a perfect deal. It wouldn't have been a European beautiful deal. It would have just been a deal with a few Taliban in the government. And in my view, we could have done that more forcefully. But as always in politics, there's a window of opportunity, and that window was closed probably last winter, but latest when President Biden pulled the plug and declared the withdrawal in April.
Basir, would you agree? Would you say there was still space for a deal between the government and the Taliban at the time that Andreas describes it?
I mean, we could then really go further beyond because you know, there was not one window of opportunity, but many windows of opportunities that were lost. I think it's way too early to talk about some of those opportunities that were created, and I'm definitely not going to talk about it in a public or a semi-public forum, because the issues are still sensitive. But this could have been very, very different. The outcome could have been very different. This whole process could have been handled very differently. The one frustration that I do have, at least here, and a lot of our Afghan partners, by the way, on all sides, both the Taliban but also the former Republic side would tell you, the EU nowhere in the course of this whole time has ever really acted independently, at least not from our perspective. So if we are being blunt about things, it has always been towing the US line. Whatever the US, there hasn't, you know, to my understanding, really been, at least I don't really know a country that has really stood up and said, well, you know what, maybe a different course of action. Or if there have been attempts, they you know, at least I haven't really seen a very strong one at that. Or maybe, you know, I don't know or I don't understand that transatlantic relationship that well. So forgive me for that. But as for, you know, I just do want to come back a little bit to Andreas, to why, you know, understanding the Taliban and that is still important. I understand your frustration, but first of all, putting yourself in the shoes of the Taliban is not really a theoretical exercise. It's actually what you need. Let's not even talk about the consequences other than migration, the massive migration that you just mentioned. So whether you like it or not, I'm sorry, but you still have to engage, and you still have to do that if you want to, you know, if you want those, if you have interests that you need to protect. So it's not just a theoretical exercise. Dialogue is always the way, and I'm afraid I would have to disagree in saying that the process is over. Military victory is not peace. It's what we have right now is a shock, and it introduces a new chapter into the process. Peace does not come with military victory. Sustainable peace can only come with transforming the conflict in the long run.
I didn't say peace, I said they won the war.
Yeah, but that does not mean that that is the end of this process or the end of Afghanistan. Or now, because the Taliban are in power, then all of the 35 million should also be forgotten because we are too frustrated and now we don't want to understand what the Taliban are all about.
So what's your proposal then, if I may interject? Because basically you just said the EU never had a unified position, but then who is pushing for the Taliban to fulfill those 5 conditions? The EU? I mean, this is your proposal? Because the United States won't do it.
I think it's very good that at least the EU is now thinking about engagement on the basis of certain principles and conditions. But at the same time, it may be a little bit too late now in the game. I mean, you know, the Taliban are already in Kabul, so and then they have already announced the government. I mean, the frustration that I expressed was more with how this process started and where it landed us now.
If I can pick up sort of on the point of sort of how much time, right? I think there is this other element that we haven't touched on a lot, which is the economic sort of situation and the sort of liquidity crisis, as some would call it, in Afghanistan. Because, as Andreas mentioned, 75% of the public budget was financed by international donor grants that are now mostly frozen. So I wonder, in that sense, maybe Basir, I'll start with you. Sort of how, is it realistic for international donors to start funding and ensuring cash flow into the country with humanitarian assistance? Do they thereby not provide also some legitimacy to the military takeover of the Taliban?
Well, the question is, what alternatives do you have? I mean, there are, the one way is there are different channels through which you can channel the funds that the country badly needs. You don't necessarily have to put the cash in the hands of the Taliban. But if you argue, okay, if I do that, then the Taliban are going to gain legitimacy, I think we may be a little bit too late into this whole question of legitimacy. The Taliban already had a lot of legitimacy when the US opened the channel of negotiations with them. That's we are a little bit beyond that point. The point is they are now controlling the country, and the fate of millions of people is now tied to that. So, I'm not an economic expert, and I'm, pretty sure that Andreas can maybe talk more to that. But there are channels through which you can channel that money, and to fear, well, this is going to give the Taliban more legitimacy. I think the question then would be, okay, so what is the alternative? You want to cash starve the Taliban, and that way they will just go away and disappear?
So Andreas, I'll move to you sort of with the question of I know that on the EU side, indeed, one of the 5 principles is sort of the recognition also of the role of women and girls and the respect for human rights. If we want to, and respect of humanitarian principles, so you mentioned already development assistance might be frozen, but of course humanitarian assistance has to come into the country. If the Taliban, as they have in the past, would charge sort of maybe a levy, on sort of some of the projects that NGOs want to do, this would still then mean money into the hands of certain groups. So how do you see that sort of on the humanitarian assistance side?
But let's be very clear. Humanitarian assistance follows the sacrosanct principles of impartiality and independence and all of that. So we cannot tie humanitarian assistance, and we don't do that anywhere, to whether we like the government or not. So in order to save lives, we are not looking at whether we like the Taliban or their governance. Now, and as I said before, the European community, the European Union has quadrupled its humanitarian assistance, which has been roughly 70 million per year, and now it's 200 million. And I don't predict anything, but it may even increase, especially the collective humanitarian assistance by all member states. Then is the question, which isn't answered yet, whether we want to continue development assistance. And if we do that, that is political, and that can be made conditional, and we have made it conditional, and then all the nitty-gritty we'll have to see, it may...
Yeah, but can I ask, I mean, we also know that sort of years and years of humanitarian assistance is not particularly efficient or effective. So if we look at it from a development cooperation prospect, we would want to actually put development cooperation into the health sector, for example, in terms of funding, right? So there's also that then tension between these two sort of approaches. So we put principles on development cooperation, yet we also had sort of financial imperative to move to longer term sort of funding.
True, and I mean, my personal view would be that if we shift everything, if we were to rebudget now from development assistance to everything into humanitarian, we would lose the grip and the last levers that we still have. But it's not up for me to decide. It's a collective decision for our member states and governments to make. But again, I want to stress that I outlined the path that we intend to go, but I still think that it is also legitimate, if I may use this term, it's also legitimate for donors or for the international community to establish certain criteria. And we have done that, you know, if it's about fascist or right-wing governments somewhere, everybody is usually enthusiastic about doing that. And when it's now about the Taliban, there is some hesitation. You know, I'm not comparing the two, but at least there is also a legitimate idea about saying, okay, here we stop, you know, and then the country, I mean, the Taliban are definitely neither elected nor very popular in Afghanistan. So let's be very clear on that. They may have a certain, I don't know, 10, 20% at best popularity. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I wouldn't say that, okay, now Afghans, you have chosen the Taliban, so it's all your problem. I wouldn't go that far. But I would simply also say that external or international players have the right to say, this is as far as we go. Of course, trying to save lives with humanitarian assistance, but probably not more.
I think actually that would be a good point maybe to look at our audience and also see if there's questions sort of from the audience. I think I see a hand raised already, and there's someone, yeah, there's Svenja who's coming over with the mic. Maybe you can just quickly introduce yourself and then ask your question. Thanks.
Hi, Joanna Bryson, Professor of Ethics and Technology at Hertie School. My question goes to the relationship between the EU and the US that you mentioned. There was an editorial in the New York Times by someone who said he was the general or one of the generals of the Afghan army. And he reported that the entire 20 years of training of the Afghan military had assumed certain kinds of technical operations equipment that was central to the way they coordinated, and that the US folded that up and took it home 3 months before the end of occupation. And so that was why everything had collapsed, was they know that their training was suddenly useless. I actually heard a weirdly similar discussion a few days ago at the Microsoft office here about, it was about digital sovereignty. And the question was, could the EU rely on American clouds for their AI? I know that Netherlands is very concerned about what happens if Google Maps suddenly went away in the Netherlands. And the answer I was very worried about, Microsoft was one of the partners, but also the American diplomats there said, we would never do that to our friends. And I was very concerned about that qualification. I had assumed American business just wouldn't pull out. So anyway, my question is, really, as much as I care about Afghanistan broader, are there these key pins that if America pulls them out, that everything else just falls over? And did America itself even realize the extent to which it had done that?
Thanks. I think, Marina, that would be a great question for you.
Yeah, let me take it. Well, first and foremost, the collapse of the Afghan army and the victory of the Taliban, or the extremely quick victory of the Taliban, was not just because the United States pulled out the equipment. This it was kind of like the last drop in the bucket, or the straw that broke the camel's neck. And why did they pull out the equipment? Because of course they didn't want that the Taliban gets all the equipment, right? So when you go back, I would even say, you can go back over 10 years. There are fundamental dynamics in Afghanistan that made the training of an Afghan military and the police forces as well, and this was handled by a lot of European countries, just very hard. And one of the fundamental discrepancies was that the Afghan government, so under Ashraf Ghani, was always very suspicious of the military. They did not necessarily want to have a strong military because they were scared of coups. And the Western powers, they wanted, of course, a very strong military who could defeat the Taliban. So at the very heart of the entire story was basically a contradiction that two of the main actors involved had opposite aims. But then as well, you know, the recruitment, the training, probably as well there was a posture of arrogance of the Western trainers towards the Afghans. There's a massive list of problems that were hampering these training efforts, and in the big picture of things, it was not a surprise that a lot of them just didn't even fight. Not all. You had some contingents that fought, particularly in the south, but by and large, the fact that they just tried to come up with some kind of agreement with the Taliban was not necessarily surprising. At least not somebody like me who was following the situation very closely. So now, like the larger US-EU collaboration. As I mentioned before, I think the EU can do extremely little in Afghanistan. So tomorrow I will teach a class on strategy, and I invite some of you, to join it, because the big question is as well, should the EU do something in Afghanistan, right? And here it's kind of assumed, of course. But the truth is, prior to 9/11, the EU and European countries were not really involved in Afghanistan. And they joined the Afghanistan mission as a direct response. It was a response to the 9/11 attacks, and it was to signal alliance cohesion. Right? So the EU, European countries struggled a lot during the 1990s, especially with the Balkans. And one could argue that actually the participation and, we stand with you after 9/11, after the attacks, was as well because the Europeans felt extremely vulnerable in the Kosovo crisis. So there was, here mentally was the idea, we, could not handle Kosovo, and this was just, a couple months prior. So now the US needs us, so we need to show that we stand ready. And it was actually the Europeans who suggested to invoke Article 5 of NATO, not the United States. So in the big picture of things, it was an alliance endeavor, alliance cohesion endeavor, why the Europeans went to Afghanistan. And then, now that the United States is withdrawing and, the US basically said, we're done with this. Whether this is good or bad, it's a different discussion, but de facto, they're done with this. It's, a big question. Should the EU really take on this country? And not just, I know you come from a development angle and a humanitarian angle, but as well from a strategic angle. If you really in very hard terms, what's the benefit of having EU influence in Afghanistan, right? And my question to you is, what is it? Apart from normative power and doing good, there are a lot of places that need development aid, and some of them way closer to Europe, and much greater misery, at least for now, than Afghanistan. So, what is actually the strategic vision of the EU to play in Afghanistan?
I see that Andreas would like to come in, and then Basir, if you also want to come in. I also would, if there is still a question. Okay, I already see another question and another and another. Just for the audience then, we were supposed to close at 5 minutes. So of course, for me, it's okay to continue. Probably we can continue a bit longer, but then let's keep our interventions a bit shorter so we can take more questions. Thanks.
Short intervention, I'm preparing for a double front battle here. Number one, you have accused us a year ago that we are not accommodating enough with the Taliban. When our special envoy, then Roland Kobia, talked about the criteria for the Geneva conference. So I would strongly refute the idea that the European Union was not different, because the US were, after the Taliban deal, they were more accommodating with the Taliban. Whether that has had any effect is then a different question, right? So I want to get that straight on the European Union. And I would also say we have a big interest, contrary to the US, that is sitting, 7,000 kilometers away. We will have to cope with potential migration. So we have an interest to stay engaged or stay somehow interested, at least, in Afghanistan. But I agree with all the rest of you. We could not have secured the airport. We benefited from US security umbrella in Kabul for the last 20 years. Yes, it was some sort of a solidarity movement, and it was is a big allied project, you know, it's very tricky to say that given now the dramatic and sad events. But if you were in Kabul and you saw this this headquarters of ISAF and then later on the subsequent mission, it was quite fascinating to see a coalition of, I don't know, 37 countries working together. Unfortunately, the result, the impact was now not to our liking, but it was a big military project, and I would say, I mean, yeah, you're right. The Americans were driving it, but a lot of European member states, for the first time in post-war history, notably Germany, had major military operations, and yeah, again, the result is not satisfactory, but I think we will somehow learn from it.
Basir, did you want to come in?
Well, first of all, I want to set the record straight. I don't really ever recall, you know, telling you that you were not accommodating to the, or that you are not accommodating enough to the Taliban. I think our conversation was more about constructive engagement.
Ready to make, to have a dialogue, yeah.
It was more about straightening communication and about being constructive rather than, you know, what I was questioning back then was, does it really make sense? Does this approach actually get you anywhere? So, you know, just to set the record straight. And to the point of Europeans, yes, all of the, you know, the Europeans, well, the mantra was always together in, together out. Well, it was together in, but definitely not together out. Let's, you know, yes, Europeans would always tell you, of course, because, you know, we depend on the military infrastructure that the US provides. That's all very well understood. There's no question about it. We're not just talking about that, though. We are talking about opportunities being missed where Europeans could have acted very differently to take advantage of them. It was every step of the line where the US was followed. Despite the fact that there were frustrations on the part of the Europeans, despite the fact that they did not agree with the US approach, there was a lot the EU in particular could have done to change the course of things within the peace process. So that is the other.
So why didn't they do it? Give us like a 1-second answer. Why didn't they do it? Why did the EU miss all these opportunities? One sentence. Because
I think Andreas is in the best position to answer that question, but you know, so I'm not going to answer for him. I'm also not going to answer the question of what I think the engage, because you directly put that question to me. I think the EU has to first define its interests in Afghanistan and then make that the basis of the engagement, but that I'm not going to do for the EU.
So 10 seconds, you said, Andreas.
It's very tricky. What is the EU? You know, no.
It's a good Hertie question.
Yeah. To get the record straight, I was referring to the EU institutions' response, and that you considered, I would say, you considered the most, how can I say, principled or radical on the non-peace front at some point, right? But now we're talking about EU member states, and I agree with you, as NATO allies, they could have voiced their concerns more forcefully, yes, and that's what I alluded to.
Okay, we're going to take some more questions.
Still no answer, though, why they didn't do it.
Because now we have, I think, okay, so I'm going to take a few in one go. So we'll start over there. Yeah.
Hi, Kaya Landsberg, MPP 2007. You started off saying that you were very puzzled. Why? You've been there for 20 years. What happened? Why didn't you see it coming?
So we're going to take a few so that, yeah. So then we'll go over there. Yeah. Is that, yeah, over there. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for your discussion. My name is Minhas, and I was wondering something we've discussed a lot about, or you guys have discussed a lot about, on what terms and conditions to support Afghanistan, or when to not back one topic has been brought up, women's rights as well. So I was wondering if you could like shift the paradigm a bit, let's say, and just like think, if you were like in, say, in the shoes of a Taliban leader or a person in government, Mullah Baradar, for example, how would you move from here onwards? So to understand them a bit more, let's say the EU has withdrawn its support or any financial or humanitarian assistance, what would be the strategy as a Taliban leader to govern a country? You would want to govern it as in your own interest. So yeah, how would you do it?
Okay, then I see a question just there. So we'll take those three and then we'll go back to the panel. I'm also Giovanna. You have to tell me when it's really over. Then, because now we're in a flow, right? So now, of course, we want to kind of keep going.
Yeah,
Go
we
ahead.
definitely should keep going. It's super interesting. I'm Louis. I'm MPP 21. I'm curious. We kicked this off with remembering 9/11 and its 20-year anniversary. I'm curious. What does the recent changes in Afghanistan mean for Islamist terrorism? And will this mean that there is a resurgence of terrorism? And if yes, what can we do to prevent it?
Okay, that's three, I think, very good questions. I'm looking at the panel if there is specific sort of interest to take. Maybe Basir, will start with you, and if you want to answer all three, if you want to take a specific question. I know definitely the terrorism question is on the mind of the EU and the Sahel as well, right? So I don't know if you want to make links to that, but you don't have to.
Sure. I think I would answer the question on, okay, what, you know, if one would think from the Taliban's perspective, then what would I do? I think I would think about the interests that I have, and I would really think long and hard about it, because unless there is an economic miracle happening in Afghanistan, with, I don't know, China's mega economic projects that will help Afghanistan prosper in the next 5 years, we are looking at a catastrophe of really significant proportions. So I think I would have that in mind, even if it was not, you know, people-centered interest, it would even be a self-interest, because what we know is going to happen is yet another, the continuation of a conflict in very different ways. So it's impossible to sustain a country where you have already half of the population below the poverty line, and that is just going to continue increasing. So for my own self-interest, I am going to have to engage, and I'm going to have to become responsible, and I'm going to have to become a responsible member of the international community. The Islamist terrorism, I don't want to go too much into the details of it, but what we do know is that problem is there. It has not gone away. Could that have consequences beyond migration, and particularly for Europe, which is more easily accessible from Afghanistan than the US, despite the fact that the US makes its own decisions? So I think yeah, I think I will end there.
Okay, thanks. Andreas?
Why was I puzzled if I was 20 years there? I was not 20 years there, I was there 2 years. So that's the easy answer. A more complex answer is that I was not referring why everything failed or something like that. I was referring to the Taliban's government formation against all odds. Because, you know, if you are one of the poorest countries of the world, and you know that you depend 75% of your public expenditure is donor funded, you better act like, you know, it is the donors in the donors' conditions, quite frankly, you know. And on the question with if I was Mullah Baradar, I could easily answer the EU doesn't engage in hypothetical questions or history. However, you know, given the dire straits we're in, I would say the same. You know, I would say I would try to somehow meet or at least negotiate in a very tangible way these conditions. And by the way, it's not rocket. I mean, not rocket science. How do you say? It's not completely incredible things that we demand. It's the things that the Taliban themselves claim to abide by. you know? Let women be educated, let women continue to work, you know, respect human rights. It's not so dramatic. So that would be my question. And on the putting yourself in the Taliban shoes, I would then still say, yes, that's important for mediation, and that's important for conflict resolution. But again, I agree with Basir, we don't have perfect peace, and probably we're up for even more violence and conflict, but we're no longer in this mediation phase. Therefore, I don't see the need all the time to put myself in the Taliban's perspective. And Islamist terrorism, yes, it is a booster, no doubt about it. And not because the Taliban are interested in global terrorism. They have actually never attacked a German Christkindl market or anything of that sort. But they have not done the necessary to prevent others from using their soil and their, you know, their setup to engage in terrorism.
Yeah, how did terrorism change? Beautiful question for the professor. So let me give you a very professorial answer. Two actually major changes. So the first one is that now you have three different types of, you know, if you want, radical Islamist groupings that folks can choose from. So you still have Al-Qaeda, right? But Al-Qaeda perceives itself as a global institution. So it's not really interested in, and this is the second group, the Islamic State, creating a caliphate, right? Based on Islamic texts, they want to have their territory and basically implement, you know, certain visions that were portrayed in the Quran, if I may simplify. And then you have the third option, which is the Taliban, which basically just wants to govern its own territory, which is Afghanistan. So back in 2001, you had the emergence of one movement, Al-Qaeda, this global movement, reunifying folks from, you know, all strands of the Muslim world. And now you basically have three. And there is competition between them, and you see this. But then as well, there is cooperation, and actually it can just, you know, like for counterterrorism experts, it's actually quite difficult to see how can you fight the one, how can you collaborate with others. So, you know, like it's actually, it has complicated things quite a bit. On the counterterrorism front, and I, you know, want to finish with this because I think it's very important. So coming out of 9/11, the United States basically developed two different strategies of how to fight terrorists. The first one was going into places, right? So this is Afghanistan, but then, you know, like the French and the Europeans copied this model. I mean, Mali is basically the same. You send soldiers, you send troops and try to find the camps of the terrorists and destroy them there. And the second leg is, this is the NSA, this is the CIA, this is the FBI, so these are secret services, this is the entire Snowden program, right, that he revealed. So basically you use data flows and try to, you know, somehow find out about the plots and try to prevent them. I think the bottom line is, and this is also a conclusion for the European adventures in Mali, that the intervention model didn't really succeed. So I think going forward, what we will see is terrorism is not going away, but we will rely on secret services to collect a lot of data. So this, of course, puts a lot of pressure on, you know, privacy concerns. And then what we will have is surgical strikes, right? If you have data on plants being built again or folks meeting in certain places, you will have drone strikes, you will maybe even have airstrikes to destroy them surgically. But the idea of building democracy and, you know, like kind of turning these countries that used to be these host states for terrorists upside down and turn them into liberal democracy, I think this is totally out of the window.
Good. I would say, because I realized I didn't take a question from this side at all, if there's still, okay, let's still do these two questions. Let's do it very quick, your question right up front, and then also short answers, and then we'll wrap it up.
I have a question with regards to what was mentioned earlier of the funds that for the Afghanistan government and the people, and I understand how stakeholders at this point, it's up to them if they want to stop the flows, but how do we prevent this from actually affecting the most affected people in this picture, the people of Afghanistan? Because I myself, I'm from Venezuela, and you mentioned, okay, yeah, they can stop the funds if you want, as long as we continue to make sure that there is humanitarian aid. But they can very easily say, we're not going to accept this aid if there's no funds for other things, which we have seen in other places. So I'm just wondering with that.
Okay, thanks. And then I think the question was over there, Svenja. Oh, there's the, yeah. And then maybe we can do sort of concluding remarks with those questions.
Thank you, Leonard Östergaard, MA 2019. My quick question would be, can we speak about the Taliban as one actor, or are the Taliban in Doha saying different things than Taliban on the ground in Afghanistan, and how is that maybe affecting future dialogue or cooperation with them?
Thanks. Okay. I'm going to leave it at those two questions. And I'll, if it's okay, Marina, shall we start with you? Or
Well, you know, I'm a macro person, right? And I learn a lot from practitioners on the ground. But I'm just sometimes a little bit worried how, you know, you get sucked up in these micro processes. And I understand where you're coming from, right? But I think as Europeans in this room, and of course as well, like from all over the world, we always need to ask the question, so, you know, like, how does this fit into the big picture of things, right? So, like, what does actually the fall of Kabul, but as well, you know, the US withdrawal, what the EU does there, what Germany does there, and what all your countries do there? How does this fit in to the big objectives that you would actually like to reach? And, you know, I think Germany, Europe hasn't fully found an answer to this. You know, I think a lot of these, what you have been discussing here is like bits and pieces. You know, you want to do a really good job on the ground, but what's the larger objective? And you know, if I may recommend, you know, I think for students and of course, like for our governments, that is absolutely critical going forward.
Thanks, Andreas.
Is this really working? Yeah. Just a little provocation, I would say, as a proud European, I think the US hasn't figured that out either, quite frankly. How to deal with China and how to deal with the problems they claim that they are now looking at, you know, hastily withdrawing from Afghanistan. But I would also want to say on the question from Venezuela, if I may say, we will do our utmost to save lives and to avoid starvation and hunger together with the UN and together with all our partners. Nevertheless, I would say that it is first and foremost a responsibility of a national government to protect and feed your people. So, you know, it cannot all be blamed on the international community. But again, we will do whatever we can on the humanitarian. And on Doha, I think the best person to respond is Basir, but I would say there are not many Taliban left in Doha, and therefore it's a bit of an academic debate now. I would say that there were rifts, there were differences, as in any other complex movement, but I would also say we may have fooled ourselves, and in that I agree with you that we all may have followed too much the US lead. We may have fooled ourselves thinking that everything that happened in Doha actually represented the truth and the reality. And in that regard, talking about the past, in hindsight, there were differences.
All right, Basir.
On the question of humanitarian aid and the reference to Venezuela, I spoke here quite a few times now about, understanding the Taliban or the Taliban trying to understand others. One thing we have to also count on, in addition to what Andreas already said, and that is this favorite term or two terms that I have learned here at Hertie. My professor Mark is sitting there. There is this output legitimacy aspect that is very, very important, for an insurgency that is just trying to transform itself into a government. And when when you don't have elections, as Andreas pointed out earlier, and legitimacy is obviously a key question, then where do you go to? You have to deliver on some of the most fundamental and on some of the core issues that you have been talking about for the last 20 years when you were engaged in this fighting. So I think that that is a fair assumption, at least to make the basis for engagement. And yes, there's always going to be what is going to happen in practice, and whether situations like that could arise, and whether you would have to readjust. On the question of the division among the Taliban, this question is since the insurgency first came back, there's always this there are divisions among the Taliban. We have worked with the Taliban, back in the days when they were still considered terrorists, and you could be in all kinds of blacklists and troubles at the US and elsewhere if you were traveling. I haven't really seen these is there diversity? Of course there is. They also managed to form a government in what, three weeks? There are literally people who hadn't seen each other, met each other in the last 20 years when they were... Yeah, and how long does it take in Germany after an election to form a government? I have not seen any indication of the Taliban. There were also these, a lot of people telling me, oh, but the Taliban in Doha, they're not really speaking for their leadership. Well, guess what? 12 of them ended up on the leadership, that they were not speaking for them. I've never really bought into that, and there are other, the ceasefire that happened. Is there diversity? Could there be rifts? Yes. There are serious rifts that one could see. Yeah, this could implode. At least until now, I don't have any evidence that I could tell you. Yeah, there's going to be an explosion in the next, couple of years.
Okay. On that note, thank you so much to our great panelists, and thank you to the Hertie School and also the Hertie Alumni Affairs team for providing the space and the time for this discussion tonight, which went a bit over time. We also started a bit late, so I think it was fine, and now it's ready to, I think we're all ready to enjoy the reception, and thanks again.